Now, when I got to high school, I was relieved to find out that I would get to ride public transportation rather than the yellow school bus. I like to read on my way home, and I could rarely do that on the yellow bus with its flying spitballs and screeching middle schoolers. And so that first day of high school, I excitedly boarded the Cincinnati Metro. I showed the driver my bus card, and I sat down on one of the blue, hard plastic seats. The bus smelled vaguely of popcorn, garbage, and perfume. At 7:15 in the morning, it already had a significant number of people on it. I scanned the seats and noticed the odd mix of business professionals in gray suits, a few parents with sleeping children, a college student who appeared to be frantically editing a paper, and a person with a silver nose ring and textured dreadlocks drinking a smoothie that looked like frappéd mud. I sat down. Now, across from me, there was an older gentleman who appeared to have a vision impairment. He held a cane and had dark glasses on. His friend sat next to him, and they were involved in some conversation. I tried to settle into my seat and begin reading my book as the late summer scenery whizzed by outside. But I remember being frustrated to learn that the Metro bus was no haven for reading either. I was having trouble concentrating because the person with the dark glasses was talking pretty loudly. I tuned in and out, but began to gather that he was speaking of his religious convictions. Oh, joy, I thought. As we rode, he became more and more animated. I belong to a church that doesn't believe in all that liberal theology crap, he said. Too many churches think that people are born good. They are not. And those churches don't follow the Bible, which is the Word of God. It is meant to be literally interpreted. Most people don't get that anymore. The other writers seemed to be ignoring the man editing their paper, drinking their smoothie, but I was listening. I was curious. As a Unitarian Universalist youth, I was somewhat fascinated and somewhat mystified to hear this person pushing against all of the things that I had grown up learning in Sunday school. Now, I wasn't naive, thinking that all people believed the same way that I did. I have Pentecostals and devout Catholics in my family, so I was aware. But that day, as on the bus, I was perturbed to hear the contempt in the man's voice for the word liberal, which he seemed to say almost with a kind of sneer. It was obviously a distasteful thing for him. And he wasn't taking aim at liberal politics, mind you. Though I imagine he probably didn't have much fondness for that either. But he was taking aim at liberal religion. He was taking a stand, making a testimony, rejecting this thing that he believed to be wholly in error. And he believed it so deeply that he was willing to say so pretty loudly in public. In the novel The Magic Mountain by Thomas Mann, two of the central characters engage in a conversation about their grandfathers. Hans Castorp comes from a conservative German family, and he describes his grandfather as being a man from another time who had only accommodated himself in part to contemporary life. He would have been more comfortable living in the century before the Enlightenment. Now, Giuseppe Settembrini, on the other hand, describes his grandfather as a fervent defender of human rights. He led Italy in repeated attempts to overthrow the medieval orders of government and religion, believing always in human dignity over tradition. In their later years, both of these grandfathers, never once meeting each other or even knowing about each other, come to wear black. One is for the loss of the old traditional order. The other is because the uprising for human rights had failed in Italy. These grandfathers come to stand in for the orders of the old and the new, the traditional and the liberal, both men equally committed to their opposing visions. I sort of imagine this man on the bus like one of those grandfathers, and there was something I admired in it. He had taken a stand, become firm in his convictions, made his beliefs known. He wasn't shy about it. I had to admit that I did not know a lot of people on the liberal side of theology who would fit into that mold, who would be so courageous. People at my church were quieter about their beliefs. They probably thought that interrupting someone reading on the bus was in bad taste, and it was. But this whole thing made me wonder, was it only the conservative side that inspired commitment? Was there anyone who felt passionately and stood up for liberal religion? As it turns out, history gives us a number of liberal religious people who did just that. Julia Ward Howe, the peace activist and creator of Mother's Day, is one of the people who comes to mind. She was a Unitarian, but she was raised in a conservative Calvinist household. Her father was a deeply theologically conservative Calvinist, and he would take his daughter to worship services. Sitting in the narrow white pews of the sweltering hot church, Howe would listen to the sermons with an overwhelming sense of dread. It began to dawn on her that she was going to hell. Not surprisingly, Howe came down with a severe case of insomnia. In the early hours of the morning, she would curl up on the top of the cold, creaky wooden steps of her home, terrified that at any time the ground beneath her would open up and swallow her into hell. Her father did nothing to assuage this terror, and she went on thinking this way for years. But it slowly began to dawn on Howe that there was something wrong with this vision. So one day, while reading Paradise Lost, it occurred to her that this kind of theology seemed to make evil and depravity stronger than love and human goodness. She writes in her diary, "Suddenly, this vision appeared to me impossible, and I threw away once and forever the thought of the terrible hell which till then had always formed a part of my belief." She followed this passage up by writing, "This theology of hell is not my religion. In an excited state, I strove to make it so, but I nearly lost my reason in the attempt." She swore from that day forward that she would never try to foist on young minds the terrorizing, fear-based theology that she had grown up with. That image of Howe as a little girl sitting on her steps, trembling over the theology that she had heard, sticks with me. She found in liberal religion a more humanizing message, one that began not with fear, but rather with affirmation. And this, I think, is where liberal religion begins. It says that human beings are basically good and worthy. We witness this today in the liturgy of our child dedication. We Unitarian Universalists believe that humans are born good and have the ability to change their world for the better. We believe that people are blessed with the faculty of reason and should use it to test religious ideas and assumptions and to help us better understand our world. And so liberal religion has never shied away from scientific methods and developments and instead has embraced them. Further, because people are basically good, the human race is not destined to be split into the saved and the damned. Instead, we're all in this together. And no one religion is uniquely true. Indeed, all religions share many truths, according to this vision. This is because those other traditions that come from other parts of the world were also created by human beings who are good and worthy as well, and so their insights should not be written off out of hand. This vision is, of course, counterpoised with conservative approaches to theology. And while I'm simplifying things here, the conservative approach to theology often goes something like this. Humanity is sinful. It needs the inerrant and literal word of the Bible to show us the way. The human faculty of reason cannot be trusted. Only the Bible and tradition can be trusted. Ultimately, because of our sinfulness, all of humanity will be divided up into the saved and the damned, some destined for eternal reward, others for eternal punishment. Christianity is a unique revelation. It is the only gate through which someone can be saved. Other traditions are, at best, misguided attempts to grasp a truth that eludes them. In the Magic Mountain, the two grandfathers are captivated by their opposing visions of the world. And I don't think it's without reason. The way that we organize and understand the world is at stake in these two visions. They beckon us to choose between them because the decision about these theological worldviews changes the way that we view the rest of life. Now, it's not always predictable how theology will influence our other beliefs, but often, it spills out into the ways that we view politics, our thoughts about raising children and forming families, our ideas about the future. They are foundational beliefs that frequently saturate arguments about crime and punishment, about a woman's right to choose, about which couples are worthy of getting a cake at a bakery, about how we treat the environment. In short, I do not think that there is anything that these approaches to theology have left untouched. Norbert Capek, the minister who started the flower communion that we celebrated here today, he knew this. Upon returning to Czechoslovakia after World War I, he founded a Unitarian congregation in Prague called the Liberal Religious Fellowship. Thousands flocked to his new church. His religious sentiments were hopeful, inspiring, and reasonable. And he was also courageous in sharing them. During the Nazi occupation of Czechoslovakia, the Gestapo broke into the apartment of Capek, confiscated his books and sermons, and arrested him and his youngest daughter. He was charged with treason because he had preached publicly against the Nazi government. He believed that his liberal religious convictions called him to do so, and he did it knowing fully the danger that such activity would court. And so the Gestapo took him to the Dachau concentration camp, where he was tortured and eventually executed. When news of his death reached the United States, the American Unitarian Association president Frederick May Elliott wrote this: "Another name is now added to the list of heroic Unitarian martyrs, of heroic people who stood up for liberal religious ideals. His death for the freedom of a liberal faith has now been bought. Ours is now the responsibility to see to it that we stand fast in the liberty that he so gloriously won." I think back to my time on the bus all of those years ago, listening to the gentleman give his testimony to conservative religion. My point today is not to simplify him or demonize him or in any way turn him into a caricature. He was, of course, a human being with hopes and dreams and a life that was much fuller than any theological position can capture, and that is true for all of us. But I do want to notice today that he spent time considering his stance, and I respect that. At some point, he said yes to his church's conservative approach to theology. It made a difference in his life. It shaped who he was. That was his testimony. This is mine. I'm not afraid to stand with Hal and Capek and others to affirm liberal religion and its interpretation of a faith that has been so humanizing and so hopeful to so many. I am not afraid to stand with them and say, yes, this is what I believe and this is what I love, because at the end of the day, I think it is good news that we have to share. It is worthy. It is worthy of something that to be loved. It comes from a legacy of people who have made bold decisions and tried to stand for what was right. It makes a difference in how I approach the world and the people that I meet. It changes the way that I think about politics and families and children and the environment. It makes me hopeful about humanity's ability to cast a better future, to create something that is better than what our ancestors were able to create before us. For all of these reasons and more, I am called to say yes to it. I'm called to say yes to it. That's who I am. That's what I believe. That's what my testimony is today. The rain is falling on this beautiful spring morning. Children are being dedicated. We are exchanging flowers. My friend, what is it that you will say yes to today?